I'm proud of you, Laura. My mother said those words when I was 60 years old. For a moment the room went completely quiet, the kind of quiet where you can hear the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen and the soft ticking of a wall clock somewhere down the hallway. I looked at her, trying to decide if I had heard her correctly. My mother, Margaret Bennett, had never said those words to me before. Not when I graduated high school with the highest grades in my class. Not when I finished college on a scholarship and moved 3 states away to start a career in Chicago. Not when I bought my first house or raised 2 children who somehow turned out kinder and more confident than I ever felt growing up. 60 years. That's how long it took to hear the sentence I had waited my entire life for. And when it finally arrived, I just smiled. Not because it meant nothing, but because somewhere along the way, I had stopped needing it. I grew up in a small town in Ohio where winters felt long and quiet, and the houses all looked almost identical: white siding, trimmed lawns, the occasional American flag hanging beside a front porch. My mother kept our house spotless, the kind of clean where you could smell lemon polish on the wooden tables and see your reflection in the kitchen floor. She believed in discipline, in responsibility, and in doing things the right way the first time. What she didn't believe in, at least not openly, was praise. When I brought home report cards filled with straight A's, she would glance at them for a moment and nod once before placing them neatly on the counter. "That's what I expect," she would say. When I spent weeks practicing piano pieces for a school recital and played them perfectly, she would simply ask if I remembered to finish my homework afterward. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't loud or angry. It was quiet, steady, and constant. I grew up believing that approval was something you earned someday, later, after you had done enough to deserve it. So I tried harder. I stayed up late studying while other kids watched television. I worked part-time during college to cover expenses that my scholarship didn't handle. When I landed my first job in Chicago, I called my mother that same night, standing beside a pay phone outside my apartment building because cell phones weren't common yet. I remember the cool autumn air, the distant sound of traffic, and the way my heart raced while I told her the news. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then she said, "That's good. Just make sure you work hard." I told myself that was her way of being proud. Years passed. Life happened the way it does for most people, quietly and steadily. I built a career, raised 2 kids, paid mortgages and grocery bills, and learned how to handle problems without asking anyone else for help. Every holiday I drove back to Ohio to see my mother. Every visit looked almost exactly the same. The same kitchen table. The same smell of coffee in the morning. The same polite conversations about work and weather and the neighbors down the street. And every time I left, a small part of me still wondered if maybe this would be the visit when she said the words I had waited to hear since childhood. But that day never came. Not when I was 25. Not when I was 40. Not even when I turned 50. Somewhere around that time I stopped expecting it. I stopped measuring my life against a sentence that might never come. I built a life that felt complete without it. Which is why, sitting in that quiet house at 60 years old, when my mother finally looked at me and said, "I'm proud of you," all I did was smile. The truth is that silence can shape a person more than harsh words ever could. Growing up with my mother meant learning how to read small details that other people would probably never notice. A slight nod meant approval. A longer pause meant disappointment. The way she set down a coffee cup a little harder than usual could tell me that I had somehow done something wrong, even if I had no idea what it was. As a child, I believed every quiet reaction was a message I needed to decode. I watched her closely the way some children watch the weather, always trying to predict what might come next. Our house on Maple Street was modest but comfortable, the kind of place where the lawn was trimmed every Saturday morning. And the mailbox was polished so it never looked rusty. Inside, everything had a place. The kitchen towels were folded perfectly. The dishes were stacked by size and color. Even the family photographs were arranged in frames that matched each other exactly. My mother believed that order in a home meant order in a life. I tried to live up to that belief the only way I knew how. I kept my room clean. I finished homework before dinner. I helped carry groceries from the car, even when the bags were heavy and the summer heat made the pavement warm under my shoes. When I brought home good grades, I waited quietly while my mother looked at the report card. Sometimes she would raise her eyebrows slightly, which I took as a good sign. Other times, she would simply slide the paper back toward me and ask what my plans were for the next semester. What I never heard was the simple sentence that so many of my friends seemed to hear from their parents. I noticed it most when I visited other homes. One afternoon in 8th grade, I stayed after school to help decorate the gymnasium for a winter dance. When my friend Emily finished hanging streamers across the wall, her father walked in carrying a box of supplies and said something I still remember word for word. He said, "That looks great, Emily. I am proud of you." The words were so ordinary that no one else in the room reacted. But for me, they felt almost unreal, like hearing a phrase from a language I had never been taught. On the drive home that evening, I kept repeating the sentence quietly in my mind, wondering what it might feel like to hear it directed at me. From that moment on, I worked even harder. I volunteered for extra assignments in school. I joined clubs and stayed late to help teachers organize events. I thought that if I collected enough accomplishments, if I stacked them one on top of another like books on a shelf, eventually my mother would notice in a different way. Sometimes she did notice. When I won an academic award during my senior year of high school, she attended the ceremony and sat in the back row of the auditorium wearing the same navy blue coat she always wore in winter. When my name was called, she clapped politely along with everyone else. Later that night, she told me that the school had done a nice job organizing the event. I waited for something more, but it never came. At the time, I told myself that her pride must exist somewhere beneath the surface, hidden the way underground water runs beneath dry land. I believed that if I just kept going long enough, if I kept proving myself year after year, one day that hidden feeling would finally rise to the surface and become words. For most of my life, that belief quietly guided almost every decision I made. I carried that belief with me when I left Ohio for the first time at 22 years old. Chicago felt enormous compared to the quiet streets I had grown up on. The buildings seemed to rise forever, and the noise of traffic never completely faded, even late at night. My first apartment was small, barely 600 square feet, with a narrow kitchen and a living room that looked out over a busy intersection. I remember standing by the window during my first week there, watching the headlights move through the dark like slow rivers of light, and realizing that I had built this step of my life entirely on my own. I called my mother that evening because part of me still wanted her to hear the excitement in my voice. I told her about the job, the apartment, and the view from the window. There was a short pause on the phone before she answered in her steady, practical tone. She said that Chicago was a big city and that I should be careful and focus on my work. Then she asked if I had remembered to set aside money for rent and groceries. I assured her that I had planned everything carefully. When the conversation ended, I placed the phone back in its cradle and stood quietly in the kitchen for a moment. I realized that nothing had really changed. Even though I had moved hundreds of miles away and started an entirely new chapter of my life, the pattern between us remained the same. Over the next decade, my life continued to grow in ways that once would have felt unimaginable to the younger version of myself sitting at the kitchen table on Maple Street. I worked long hours, slowly earning promotions and building a reputation as someone who could be trusted with difficult projects. Eventually, I saved enough money for a down payment on a small townhouse on the north side of the city. Not long after that, I met Daniel at a friend's backyard barbecue one summer evening. He had an easy laugh and a calm way of listening that made people feel comfortable almost immediately. Our relationship developed slowly and naturally, and a few years later we were married in a small church ceremony attended by friends, co-workers, and of course my mother. She sat quietly in the second row wearing a pale gray suit and watching the service with the same composed expression she had worn for most of my life. When the ceremony ended, she hugged me briefly and told Daniel that she hoped we would take good care of each other. It was not emotional, but it was sincere in its own reserved way. Later that evening, while guests talked and music played softly in the background, I found myself glancing toward her more than once, wondering if perhaps this moment might be the one when she would say the words I had hoped for since childhood. Instead, she complimented the caterer and said the venue was lovely. Life continued forward just as it always does. Daniel and I built a home together, raising 2 children who filled the house with energy and laughter. My career continued to grow, bringing new responsibilities and new opportunities that I once would have thought were far beyond my reach. Through all of those years, I still visited my mother several times a year, driving the same familiar route back to Ohio, parking in the same driveway, walking through the same front door where the smell of fresh coffee and furniture polish greeted me every time. Our conversations were always polite and calm, touching on work, the weather, and the latest news from neighbors or distant relatives. She would listen carefully when I talked about the children or the projects I was managing at work, sometimes nodding thoughtfully, sometimes offering practical advice. Yet even as my life filled with achievements and responsibilities, one small part of me continued to wait quietly for something that never seemed to arrive. I began to notice something changing inside me sometime in my early 40s, though at first I could not name it clearly. It was not anger, and it was not disappointment exactly. It was more like a quiet realization that had been forming slowly over many years, like fog lifting from a field after sunrise. By that point, Daniel and I had settled into a steady rhythm of life. Our daughter, Emily, was already in middle school, and our son, Jacob, had just started elementary school. Weekdays were full of ordinary routines that somehow felt meaningful. Packing lunches in the morning, driving the children to school, answering emails before the workday truly began. Evenings were filled with homework at the kitchen table, soccer practices at the local park, and the comforting sound of dishes clinking softly in the sink after dinner. In those busy years, I rarely had time to sit and analyze my feelings about the past. Yet every once in a while something small would remind me of the difference between the way I had grown up and the way I was raising my own children. One evening, Emily walked into the kitchen holding a science project she had spent days building. It was a model of the solar system made from painted foam spheres hanging from thin strings. She set it carefully on the table and looked at me with that hopeful expression children have when they are not yet sure how their effort will be received. I studied the planets turning slowly in the air above the cardboard base and told her that it looked wonderful. I told her that I was proud of how patient she had been while building it. Her face lit up instantly, the way a porch light comes on when the evening grows dark. She hugged me tightly, and then ran off to show her father the project as well. I stood there in the kitchen for a moment after she left, holding the empty space where the solar system had been. The words I had spoken to her were simple, almost automatic. Yet hearing them out loud made something inside my chest shift slightly. I realized that I had said those words to my children many times over the years without hesitation. I said them after good report cards, after music recitals, after small, everyday achievements that might seem insignificant to someone else. Saying them felt natural, like breathing. That was the moment when I first wondered why those same words had been so difficult to hear during my own childhood. Over the next few years, that thought returned more often. Each visit back to Ohio felt familiar in all the same ways. The same driveway, the same quiet living room, the same neat rows of family photographs arranged on the shelves. My mother had grown older by then, though she still carried herself with the same careful posture and calm manner. We would sit together at the kitchen table drinking coffee while sunlight came through the window above the sink. She would ask about the children, about Daniel, about the projects I was managing at work. I would answer each question honestly, describing the small victories and challenges that filled our days. She listened attentively, sometimes nodding, sometimes offering practical suggestions about things like saving money or keeping the house organized. Those conversations were always respectful, even warm in their own restrained way. Yet when I left and drove back toward Chicago, I sometimes noticed that the old feeling of waiting had begun to fade. It was not because I had stopped caring about my mother. It was because I had started to understand something about the quiet space between expectations and reality. For most of my life, I had believed that one particular sentence would somehow complete a missing piece of my story. But somewhere in the middle of raising my own family, I had slowly begun to build that sense of completeness on my own. As the years continued to pass, the visits to Ohio grew quieter in a different way. Not sad, not tense, just quieter. My children were getting older by then, moving steadily toward their own lives. Emily was preparing for college, and Jacob had discovered a deep interest in engineering and spent hours building small mechanical models on the dining room table. Daniel often joked that the house felt like a workshop mixed with a library because there were always books, notebooks, and small tools scattered across every surface. I watched them both grow with a sense of pride that felt warm and uncomplicated. When they succeeded at something, I told them so immediately. When they struggled, I reminded them that effort mattered just as much as results. Those conversations came easily to me because I had spent so many years imagining what it might feel like to hear them myself. One autumn weekend, I drove back to Ohio alone to see my mother. The trees along the highway had turned bright shades of red and gold, and dry leaves moved across the road whenever the wind picked up. The drive had become so familiar that I could almost measure time by the sequence of landmarks along the route. The old gas station near the state line, the long stretch of farmland where the road curved gently for miles, and finally the quiet exit that led back toward Maple Street. My mother was waiting at the door when I arrived, just as she had done for decades. Her hair had grown thinner and lighter over the years, and her movements were slower than I remembered from my childhood, but her posture was still straight and composed. Inside the house, everything looked exactly as it always had. The furniture sat in the same places. The photographs on the shelves had not changed their arrangement. Even the smell of coffee and lemon polish was the same. We spent the afternoon talking about ordinary things. She asked about Emily's college applications and Jacob's latest projects. I told her about the company where I was now managing an entire department, something that would have felt impossible when I first arrived in Chicago all those years earlier. She listened carefully, her hands folded around a coffee mug as she considered each detail. At one point she nodded and said that it sounded like a great deal of responsibility. The way she said it almost sounded like admiration, though she did not use that word directly. For a moment I noticed that familiar feeling from long ago, the quiet hope that perhaps the conversation might turn in a different direction this time. But the feeling passed quickly, like a cloud drifting across the sun. Instead, I found myself simply enjoying the calm rhythm of the afternoon. We cooked dinner together the way we used to when I was younger, standing side by side in the kitchen while the sound of a radio played softly in the background. My mother still followed recipes exactly, measuring every ingredient carefully and wiping the counter whenever a single drop of sauce touched the surface. Watching her move through those familiar routines made me realize how much of my own habits had quietly come from her example. After dinner, we sat in the living room while the evening light faded outside the windows. The room grew dim except for the warm glow of a lamp beside the sofa. For the first time in many years, I noticed that the old feeling of waiting had almost completely disappeared. I was no longer measuring the conversation by what was missing. I was simply present, listening to the quiet voice of the woman who had shaped so much of my life, even in the ways she never fully explained. The months after that visit passed in a calm and familiar rhythm. Back in Chicago, life continued to move forward the way it always had. Emily left for college the following year, and the day we helped her carry boxes into her dorm room felt both exciting and strangely quiet. The hallway was full of parents and students moving in every direction, rolling suitcases across the floor and stacking textbooks on small desks that looked far too narrow for the long nights of studying that would come later. When Emily finished arranging the last of her belongings, she hugged me tightly and said she hoped she would make me proud. I remember smiling at her and answering without hesitation that she already had. The words felt natural and warm, the same way they always did when I spoke to my children. On the drive back home, Daniel reached over and squeezed my hand for a moment while the late afternoon sun stretched across the highway. Neither of us said much during that drive because we were both thinking about how quickly time moves. That same evening, after we returned to our house, I found myself standing quietly in the kitchen looking at the empty chair where Emily usually sat during dinner. It was a simple moment, but it reminded me again how much of parenting is made of small sentences that stay with a child for years. A few weeks later, I called my mother the way I usually did on Sunday evenings. The conversation began the same way it always had. She asked how Emily was adjusting to college and whether Jacob was still working on the small machines he liked to build in the garage. I described Emily's classes and told her about the way Jacob had recently constructed a working model of a bridge using nothing but with sticks and careful measurements. My mother listened carefully, occasionally asking a practical question about how far the college was from home or whether Jacob planned to study engineering one day. Her voice sounded slightly slower than usual, as if each sentence required a little more thought than before. At the time, I assumed it was simply the result of age. After all, she was well into her 80s by then. Even so, her mind remained sharp, and she still followed the details of our lives with quiet attention. During that call, she also asked about my work. By that point, I had been managing a large team for several years, coordinating projects that involved dozens of people and tight deadlines that sometimes stretched late into the evening. When I explained one particularly complicated assignment we had just completed, she was silent for a few seconds before responding. Then she said something that caught my attention in a subtle way. She said that it sounded like a great deal of responsibility and that she hoped I was taking care of myself while carrying it. The sentence was simple, yet there was something softer in her voice than I had noticed before. After we ended the call, I sat for a moment in the quiet living room, listening to the low hum of the heating system as autumn air cooled the city outside. For most of my life, I had believed that my relationship with my mother would always follow the same quiet pattern we had known for decades. Yet something in that conversation felt slightly different, as if the distance between us had shifted by just a small amount. I did not know then that within the next year our conversations would begin to change in ways neither of us had ever expected. The following winter arrived quietly, bringing the kind of cold Midwestern mornings where frost collects along the edges of the windows and the sky looks pale long before the sun fully rises. In Chicago, my days continued to move forward with the same steady rhythm that had shaped most of my adult life. Work remained busy. Jacob was finishing his final year of high school, and Emily called home regularly to describe her classes and the new friends she had made. Those calls were usually full of energy, the kind of excitement that comes when a young person begins discovering the world beyond the place where they grew up. One Sunday afternoon, while I was organizing paperwork in my home office, my phone rang, and I saw my mother's number on the screen. Her voice sounded calm as always, but there was a slight pause between her sentences that made me listen more carefully. She told me that she had been feeling tired lately, and that her doctor had suggested a few routine tests just to make sure everything was fine. The way she said it was casual, almost dismissive, as if she did not want to create unnecessary concern. Even so, something about the quiet tone in her voice made me decide that I should visit her again soon. 2 weeks later, I drove back to Ohio on a gray morning when the clouds hung low over the highway and the trees stood bare along the fields. When I arrived at the house on Maple Street, I noticed immediately that my mother moved more slowly than before. She still opened the door herself and welcomed me inside with the same calm expression, but there was a new carefulness in the way she walked across the room. We spent the afternoon sitting at the kitchen table, drinking coffee and talking about ordinary things the way we always had. She asked about Jacob's plans after graduation and whether Emily had decided on a major at college. I answered each question while watching the small details of her movements, the way she rested her hands on the table for a little longer between sentences, and the way her eyes sometimes closed briefly as if she were gathering energy before speaking again. At one point she looked toward the window where the winter light filtered through the thin curtains and said that time passes faster than people expect. It was not a dramatic statement, just an observation spoken in her usual steady voice. I nodded because I understood exactly what she meant. We talked for several more hours that afternoon, moving slowly from one topic to another while the daylight outside gradually faded into evening. When it was time for me to leave, she walked with me to the front door the same way she always had. The air outside felt sharp and cold, and a thin layer of snow covered the quiet street. Before I stepped onto the porch, she placed a hand lightly on my arm and looked at me with an expression that was difficult to describe. It was thoughtful, almost searching, as if she were considering something she had not yet decided how to say. Then she simply told me to drive safely and to call when I arrived home. During the drive back to Chicago that night, the highway stretched out ahead of me under a sky filled with pale winter stars. I kept thinking about the way my mother had looked at me before I left, and about the quiet sentence she had spoken earlier that afternoon about time moving faster than we expect. For most of my life, our conversations had followed the same familiar path, steady and predictable. Yet something in the air that day suggested that the path might soon change in a way neither of us had planned. Spring arrived slowly that year, bringing longer days and the soft return of green across the trees outside my office window in Chicago. Life continued moving forward in its steady rhythm, but the memory of that winter visit stayed quietly in my mind. A few weeks after that trip, my mother called again one evening just as the sun was beginning to set. Her voice sounded calm, but there was a tiredness in it that had not been there before. She told me that the doctor had asked her to come back for a few more appointments. Nothing urgent, just more checkups to understand why she had been feeling so worn down. I listened carefully while she explained it in her usual practical way. almost as if she were describing the maintenance schedule for a car rather than her own health. When the call ended, I sat for a long moment at the kitchen table while the evening light faded outside. Something inside me felt unsettled, the quiet instinct that tells you when life may be shifting in a direction you cannot yet see clearly. 2 days later, I packed an overnight bag and drove back to Ohio again. The early spring air was cool and fresh, and patches of snow still rested in the shadows along the fields beside the highway. When I arrived at the house on Maple Street, I noticed immediately that the yard looked smaller than it had in my childhood memories. The maple tree near the driveway was taller now, its branches stretching across, the roof like long arms reaching toward the sky. My mother opened the door slowly, but with the same composed smile she had always worn. Inside the house, everything remained neat and carefully arranged, though there were fewer movements in the rooms than I remembered. We sat together in the living room where the afternoon sunlight fell across the carpet in long golden lines. For a while we talked about ordinary things the way we always had. She asked how Jacob was preparing for graduation and whether Emily was enjoying her second year at college. I told her about their plans, about the excitement and uncertainty that always come when young people begin shaping their own futures. She listened quietly, her hands resting in her lap as she followed every detail. After a while the conversation slowed, and the room grew peaceful in the quiet way that only very familiar places can feel. My mother looked around the living room for a moment, her eyes moving across the shelves of family photographs that had been there for decades. Then she said something that made me pause. She said that when people get older, they sometimes spend more time thinking about the past, not because they want to live there again, but because they begin to see certain things more clearly than before. Her voice was gentle, thoughtful, almost reflective in a way I had rarely heard from her. I nodded slowly because I understood the feeling she was describing. Over the years, I had also begun to look back at my childhood with a different kind of perspective, one that included patience and understanding instead of the quiet questions I used to carry. The afternoon passed with that same calm atmosphere between us, a sense that something unspoken was slowly moving closer to the surface of our conversation. As evening approached, the light outside the windows softened into the warm colors of sunset, and the house felt peaceful in a way that reminded me of countless evenings from long ago. I did not know then that the quiet conversation we were about to have would bring a sentence I had once waited decades to hear, a sentence that would arrive not with drama or celebration, but with the same simple honesty that had shaped our entire relationship. The room was quiet except for the soft ticking of the old clock. On the wall, the same clock that had hung in that living room since I was a child. The evening light had almost completely faded outside the window, leaving the house wrapped in a calm stillness that felt both familiar and strangely important. My mother sat across from me in her usual chair, her hands folded loosely in her lap, while she looked toward the photographs on the shelf beside the lamp. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. It was the kind of silence that does not feel uncomfortable when two people have shared an entire lifetime of quiet conversations. Finally, she turned her head slightly and looked directly at me. Her expression was thoughtful, almost careful, as if she were choosing her next words with more attention than usual. She took a slow breath before speaking. Then she said my name the way she always had, steady and clear. Laura. I waited because I sensed that something important was about to follow. She looked at me for another second, and then said a sentence I had imagined hearing for most of my life. She said that she was proud of me. The words were simple, spoken in the same calm tone she used for everything else. Yet the moment they reached my ears, I felt time shift in a quiet way, as if the past and present had briefly touched the same place. For just an instant, I saw the younger version of myself sitting at the kitchen table on Maple Street with a report card in my hands, hoping that the person across from me might say those exact words. I remembered the long years of school and work and family life that followed, each chapter quietly shaped by the hope that one day I might hear them. But the surprising part was what I felt in that moment. I did not feel the rush of emotion that the younger version of myself might have expected. Instead, I simply smiled. The smile was gentle and sincere, not because the words meant nothing, but because my life had already grown full without them. Over the decades, I had built a family, raised 2 children, created a career, and learned how to recognize my own efforts with the same honesty I offered to others. Hearing the sentence at last felt less like the completion of a long search. and more like the final page of a story that had already been written. My mother watched my reaction carefully, as if she were studying the meaning behind my quiet smile. Then she nodded once, almost thoughtfully, and looked back toward the window where the last traces of daylight were fading from the sky. After a moment she spoke again, explaining something about her own childhood that I had never fully understood before. She said that in the house where she grew up, people did not often say things like that out loud. Work and responsibility mattered more than expressions of pride, and affection was usually shown through actions rather than words. She said that as the years passed, she sometimes wondered whether she should have said more to me when I was younger. I listened without interrupting, realizing that the sentence she had just spoken probably carried decades of quiet thought behind it. When she finished, the room returned to its peaceful silence. Outside, the streetlights along Maple Street had turned on, casting a soft glow across the quiet neighborhood. I sat there with her for a long time, thinking about how relationships evolve slowly over the course of a lifetime. Some words arrive early, shaping the direction of a person's confidence from the beginning. Others arrive much later, not to create a new path, but simply to illuminate the one that already exists. That evening I understood something I had not fully seen before. The words I had waited for during childhood had finally come, but by the time they arrived, I had already learned how to stand firmly within my own life. And somehow that made hearing them feel even more peaceful.